today's webinar on the SellXL workshop, and thank you for taking time out of your day today to attend this session. I'm Steve Bistritz, the developer of the SellXL workshop and co-author of the best-selling sales book, Selling to the C-Suite, which was based on the workshop. I'll be your host for today's seminar. On the screen now, you should see my contact information displayed as well as the information about the SellXL workshop. I welcome questions during this session. You should see a question area on your control panel that allows you to submit a question. My main objective today is to provide you with an overview of the SellXL workshop and, most importantly, the value it can deliver to your salespeople and to your organization. So to honor your time today, for all of those of you who have logged in on time, I'm going to get started. As I deliver workshops around the world, salespeople are always asking about the necessity of selling to C-level executives. In one recent workshop, participants clearly questioned their need to get to the C-suite with their particular solution, and they were absolutely right. I spent 28 years in the sales organization at IBM, and the continual mantra for IBM salespeople back then was sell at the top, sell at the top. Make certain you're always calling on the highest level in the client organization. In today's fast-paced digital environment, selling at the top may not always be necessary, but it's important that you're calling on the relevant executive for the sales opportunity. When I ask salespeople how they think I define the term relevant executive, I get a number of responses like decision maker, economic buyer, executive with the access to funds. In a few minutes, you'll see the definition I use for the relevant executive, and it's quite different from those definitions. What we're asking salespeople to do is to sit on the other side of the desk and to view their sales opportunity from the client's perspective. And that's one of the key takeaways of today's session. So let's take a look at more details about this one-day workshop, Selling at the Executive Level. What is SellXL? Well, very concisely, very briefly, SellXL is a one-day workshop that helps professional salespeople create, maintain, and leverage relationships at the executive level. And here's the outcomes that we expect participants to be able to achieve as a result of attending this workshop. Number one, be able to identify and align with the relevant executive for the sales opportunity. Secondly, to develop the best approach for the initial call on that executive. Third, to be perceived as the trusted advisor to the executive so that you can get return access. You know, most salespeople can get initial access, but can they get that return access? Can they get the executive calling them and calling them back into their business? And the last objective is to be able to describe and communicate your value to the executive on an ongoing basis. Now, what you may say or think is that these outcomes sound like common sense, but what we help salespeople do is put them into common practice. So let's review the modules of the SellXL workshop. Before we do that, by the way, let's do this first. Let's talk about the key reasons that salespeople lose deals. And this was from a study done by the Harvard Business Review almost 5 years ago now, but I think they still apply. And what they said then was the first key reason salespeople lose deals is lack of C-level executive access. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. We'll also focus on a couple of the other of these reasons that salespeople lose deals, like no business solutions focus. In other words, the lack of a compelling value proposition. And that's tied in with the third reason, ineffective messaging. You're not really getting your message across to the executive. Fourth, the lack of an internal mentor. And I define a mentor as someone who will sell in your absence, as opposed to a coach or a champion who might be cheering you on from the sidelines. They're present perhaps when you're there, but what happens when you're not there? My view of a mentor is someone who's going to represent you to that company when you're not in their presence, someone who will sell in your absence. And lastly, the inability to mitigate risk. Executives are managers of risk. They will take calculated risks when they see the potential of a high-value return. So let's talk about then the modules in the SellXL workshop. Number one, why call on executives? Why should you even be calling at the executive level? Secondly, how do you target the right executive? How do you define and get to that relevant executive in the client organization? How do you gain access to that executive? Fourth, how do you establish your credibility so that you get that return access? And fifth, how do you create and communicate your value to the executive? Now, a lot of what I did in the SellXL workshop was based on some research I did with CXO level executives, where I asked them about their relationships with professional salespeople. And those relationships, or those questions, covered a variety of areas. And here's the four main areas we focused on in that research. Number one, when and why did executives get involved in the decision process for major purchases? We wanted to see when senior executives got involved in the decision process. Secondly, what has to happen in meetings with salespeople for the executive to feel it was an effective meeting? Third, how do salespeople establish trust and credibility with executives? And fourth, what are executives looking for in strategic relationships with suppliers? And we did this research in conjunction with a number of other sponsors, including the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina. Hewlett-Packard was one of the original sponsors of the study. I was working for a company called Target Marketing Systems at the time. We developed there a program called Target Account Selling, and I was charged with creating a workshop on selling to senior executives, and that was the purpose of this research. So let's look at this first question. When and why do senior executives get involved in the decision process for major purchases? And here's what they said, and I'll delineate the steps in the buying cycle into these three areas: early, middle, and late stages of the buying process. And what executives told us surprised us a little bit, because what they said was they get involved early in that process to establish the project objectives, set the strategy for the project. But then they said they also get involved late. They want to help plan the implementation, and they want to measure the results. And that really surprised us, because what they said to us is, we want to understand the value that the salesperson's solution delivered to our company. So when we implement a solution, we want to understand the value that that vendor's solution returned to our company. So it's a free ticket to another meeting at the executive level. But what they also said was these middle steps here, exploring options, setting vendor criteria, examining alternatives, we typically delegate those steps down to lower level executives in the client organization. And where does your sales cycle start in this process? In a lot of cases, the sales cycle starts right there when you're the recipient of an RFP. Wouldn't it be better if you could get involved early and help the executives set the objectives for the project, set the strategy for the project, incorporate some of your solution's content into the overall objectives? That would make real sense to do that. Get involved early, help them establish the objectives, then you get the RFP, then you can respond with how your solution incorporates some of that content. And if you're in the middle of a sales cycle right now and you're in these middle steps, well, there's going to be more sales cycles with this client. So think about that. And think about when senior executives want to meet with you. It's pretty tough when you're in the middle of that sales cycle there, in the middle of that process, if you have not met with them, to get a meeting with a senior level executive that you've never met before. And when we did some of this research with CXO level executives, we used MBA students from the University of North Carolina in our original study. And these MBA students had actually been salespeople going back for their MBA. And this research project became part of their MBA curriculum, if you will. And I went with one of the MBA students as we made a practice call on a senior executive, a CIO of a company whose name you would recognize. And the MBA student asked all the questions we had prepared that I mentioned just prior to this. And when we were finished with those questions, I turned to the executive and I said, now, Jim, why would an executive at your level ever want to meet with a professional salesperson? And here's what he told me. I meet with professional salespeople because often they can offer me solutions that even people within my own organization can't develop. They've seen these problems in other organizations. And I want the benefit of their experience, of their knowledge of how they've solved those problems. Think about how that validated me as a professional salesperson. And when I tell salespeople today, what I tell salespeople today is don't look at your rank versus that of a senior level executive in the client organization. Look at the value you can deliver to them, because that's how they're viewing you. How can this salesperson deliver value to me? That's why I want to meet with that salesperson. Okay, so let's talk about now targeting the right executive. And it was interesting that Lou Gerstner, when he came into IBM, this was back in 1993, I happened to be there at the time working for IBM, and here comes this CEO from RJR Nabisco, we call them this cookie salesperson, coming into the IBM company. We said, what is this cookie salesperson going to tell us about selling mainframe computers? And he had some great insights, and here's one of them. He said, you know, IBM salespeople are calling on the wrong silos. They're focused on the CIO. And they're not getting to the functional executives in the client organization. And he wanted to become the role model for doing that. So he started calling on the CEOs and the CFOs of IBM's major clients. And he spread that down through his management team, and he expected them to spread it down and to have that process cascade throughout the organization. And he spelled this out in the book he wrote, Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? Great book, but more importantly, it gives you the insight that he got at that particular time. So he wanted IBM salespeople to get to the relevant executive in the client organization. Now, here's how I define, well, before I get to how I define the relevant executive, let me pose a question. How do you think you define that concept, the relevant executive? How do you pick out that one executive in the client organization that you should be dealing with for your sales opportunity? Well, very simply put, I define the relevant executive as the executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most by the outcome of the project or application that's associated with your sales opportunity. And if you remember what I said initially, I'm going to tell salespeople to sit on the other side of the desk. Look at your sales opportunity from the perspective of the client's project or application that sales opportunity is associated with. And what executive stands to gain the most or lose the most if that project succeeds or fails? And that's what you want to look at. And that's the relevant executive in the client organization. That's the person you want to not only identify, but align with. Now, what I'd ask you to do is think about some of the sales opportunities you've pursued, particularly one that you lost, where you aligned with the relevant executive for your sales opportunity. Because I will assure you that if you were not aligned with that executive, your competitor probably was, and he or she won the deal based on that alignment. So what we do in the SellXL workshop, it's really based on a case study, and we do this so we can keep all of the participants on one page throughout the day, and then have them apply the concepts that we've taught them in the SellXL workshop to their current sales opportunities. So we used a case study. I'm going to use one we use for the health industry, the healthcare industry. And in that particular case study, after the participants have read it, we start to debrief it. Now, I've got to tell you before we start that you are what's called the TRK system salesperson, and you're actually calling on the medical technology director, probably one of the low-level directors in the client organization. And we start asking some questions in the SellXL workshop, again, based on this case study. Is there an opportunity to pursue at this company called Jakia Health Systems? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Do we have solutions that enable us to compete? And again, absolutely yes, although we don't go into the details of those solutions in any case study that we use. We make it appropriate for the type of company that you're dealing with for the most part. But we don't go into any detail about solutions. The case study is very generic in that vein. But you, as the reader of the case study, you know that we have solutions that enable us to compete. The next key question is, can we win the opportunity calling on the key players with whom we have already established a relationship? And in most cases, the participants will agree on this, that the answer to that is no. We have to get to somebody else in the client organization, and I'll show you who that is in just a minute. Okay, but we can't win this opportunity calling on the medical technology director. So we then ask them to define the relevant executive. Who is that relevant executive? And then we talk about how we're going to get to that executive. Okay? So here's an organization chart for that case study. And again, we're using a healthcare example here. And you can see that medical technology director, Dave Powers, he's at the low level there, reports to the chief medical officer. Okay? And if we ask the question, who has the formal power for the medical technology decisions, the answer is right there with that medical technology director and the CMO. Okay? But more importantly, the next question is, who has the informal power for that decision? Who can change the formal power? Okay? And the answer is these two people right here, the CFO, Benjamin Wu, and the CFO and the CEO, Stephen Markup. Now, it turns out that the CFO, if the project goes well that we're engaged in here, he could become the CEO within the next 2 years because the current CEO is going to retire. So the CFO has kind of staked his reputation, put it online, and he is the one who stands to gain the most or lose the most. He is the relevant executive for this particular opportunity, okay? So Benjamin Wu is the executive that we need to get to, and you'll notice that he is at a higher level and in a different silo, okay? So here's the situation. Here's the person you're calling on, the medical technology director, Dave Powers, and the relevant executive, Benjamin Wu, is the person that we need to get to. So what we have to do in the workshop is to figure out how we're going to get to that relevant executive. What should be the method we use to gain access to that executive? Now, you know, when you're talking to different relevant executives in client organizations, you're typically dealing with multiple executives in the client organization. And the question is, how can you determine the irrelevant executives? Well, in a recent workshop, I put up a slide like this, And a salesperson, and it happened to be a healthcare industry, the workshop was designed for the healthcare industry in this particular case. The client was a healthcare client. And one of the salespeople jumped up and he said, well, I'll tell you how I determined the relevant executive. Let me tell you a story. And what he told us was he had been calling on the medical technology director of a very large company for some time, and he continually pursued that executive in an attempt to sell his solution. He then arranged for a meeting with the director and his boss, the chief medical officer, arranging the meeting by announcing to the director that the salesperson's regional manager was also coming to the meeting and wanted to see and meet with a senior executive at that particular organization. The regional manager and the salesperson both flew into town for the meeting with the director and the CMO, and it happened it was a snowstorm that day, and the medical technology director wasn't able to make his way into the office. The CMO, however, did make it to the office, and he said he'll have the meeting because the two people had flown into town, braved the snowstorm, and made it to the company location. During the meeting, the salesperson introduced his regional manager, discussed his solutions, reviewed his value proposition, and the CMO simply asked, what do I have to do to move this project forward? Where do I sign? The salesperson found out now that he was dealing with the relevant executive, the CMO. And the medical technology director with whom he'd had this prolonged relationship with, he was calling on him continually, he was actually the irrelevant executive. Most importantly, the salesperson now had access to the relevant executive, the CMO, and could contact that executive at almost any time to further the relationship and to pursue other opportunities within the client organization. The key is that irrelevant executives will never tell you that they're irrelevant. You have to find that out. And often you find that out the hard way. It's not easy to find out who's the irrelevant executive. So that's just a story to illustrate how you can not only define the relevant executive, but also align with the relevant executive, because that's the executive you want fighting for you moving forward. So let's talk about how do you gain access. And we're going to start with a chart, and I'll populate this chart. And basically it has the 4 ways of gaining access. And these are fairly simple. Most people are familiar with these. And as I said originally, most salespeople can get an initial call with a client executive. The question is, can you get return calls? And how do you get that initial call? What's the best way to get that initial call with the client executive? I'm going to share that with you in just a minute, but look at this last point here on the chart. Over on the right, treat the gatekeeper as a resource. And I actually take that a step further. I say treat the gatekeeper as if he or she is the client executive himself or herself. Treat that gatekeeper as if they were the executive, because often they understand what the executive's objectives are, and they can help you gain access to that executive. They hold the keys to the kingdom a lot of times, and make sure you treat them with respect and you treat them as a resource. I can't tell you how many times in my career as a salesperson that the gatekeeper has helped me. Numerous times. And here's a question we asked executives in that research project. Assuming your company was considering a major purchase, how likely would you be to schedule a meeting with a salesperson if that request came from, and you can see the different areas here, but look at this, a recommendation from someone inside your company. That could be a sponsor, a lower level executive, it can be an executive assistant, it can be a gatekeeper, but somebody at a lower level makes a recommendation to the executive said they'll see you. And even from outside the company, a consultant, a business associate, a friend recommends to the executive that they meet with you, they said most times they would do that. Here's the key. 84% of the time, executives said they would grant a meeting to a salesperson if that recommendation was provided by someone inside the company. So let's talk about developing your approach. How are you going to reach that executive for the first time? And what you're going to see here is an outline for an initial interaction with an executive. This could be a telephone call. This could be a meeting at a business show or something like that, an off-site event. And you meet with the executive. You want to have in your mind, you want to have these 4 areas carved out, ready to deliver to that executive or to the executive's assistant. So let's imagine this is a 3 to 5 minute phone call. What we tell salespeople is script this out. Put some key bullets down, okay, in terms of your introduction. Explain your connection to the person who referred you to the executive if appropriate. Then you've got to be very clear and specific as you explain the purpose of your approach. Then, to establish credibility, use the homework you've done on this company to provide a glimpse of the value you could deliver to them, perhaps explaining how you've helped other companies address similar challenges. And then lastly, commitment to action. What's the action you want that executive to take? You want to be very clear and specific again as you propose this action to the executive. And as you develop this script, here's the key. Put yourself in the position of the executive as you develop your approach. And here's another hint for you. When you're putting together this kind of outline for the initial interaction with an executive, you're scripting out, perhaps putting bullets together in these 4 areas. Put those together and then call your own voice message center and go through that interaction. Make believe you're talking to the executive and introduce yourself, state your purpose, identify your credibility, and then propose a clear and specific action. When you're finished recording it, hang up and then call the message center back and ask yourself, after listening to your message on your message system, would you respond positively to that type of message, to that type of approach? Because that's what you're trying to get that executive to respond to. So your objectives for this initial call, you want to be perceived by the executive or the executive's assistant, the gatekeeper, as being credible, compelling, and concise. And again, make certain you execute this approach from the client's perspective. Pretend you're the client. Would you respond positively to that? Now, what we do in the workshop, I'm just going to give you an example. Here's an example of an activity we do. We do multiple activities during the day, many activities during the day. This one is based on the Jakia case study that we used. And we asked the salespeople to put a script together about how they're going to interact with the CFO, Benjamin Wu, who they're trying to get to. He would be the relevant executive. We're going to determine how we're going to get to that executive, and we have worksheets for them to use to outline those 4 areas that we just talked about. And then we have them read that approach to the entire group. Now, we don't do this with everybody. We take a selected number of people to volunteer, and then we have the group critique that message. Would that message get to the executive? They know what the industry is about. They know what their typical clients are like, but it really is an eye-opener for them to see this and to try and use this approach. And what we also do in the workshop is we have a session on addressing roadblocks. We talk about the causes of roadblocks. We have a discussion around what techniques can be implemented to address or circumvent the roadblocks. We ask them what techniques have they used in the past. And at the end of that discussion, we actually have a handout that's focused totally on how to circumvent roadblocks. So again, we're trying to give them the tools and the techniques that they can use immediately when they go back to their sales territories. So let's move on to the next module, which is establishing your credibility. And in this module, we're going to talk about what I call the two components of credibility. Number one, capability. You have to demonstrate capability, but you also have to demonstrate integrity with client executives. Now, here's an example. If you're just demonstrating capability, well, you could be conceived as an extra pair of hands, an expert for hire, a consultant type, okay? And if you just demonstrate integrity, you could become perceived as reliable, trustworthy, consistent to that executive. They will like that also. But what your objective is to operate on both planes and operate in here, what we call the client value zone. And here is where you can become perceived as the trusted advisor to the executive. Here's where the relationship can become collaborative. And what I mean by collaborative is where the executive looks for ways to help you. I was working with a gatekeeper of a major healthcare company. She was asking me to give her some information. I continually did that. She told me who she worked with. It happened to be the global director of marketing for a very large healthcare company. And I worked with her over a period of several weeks. And finally she said to me, well, the executive would like to speak to you. And he'd like to get some more information about how you could help his organization. And I was able to do that and work with them. And that relationship started because I had treated that gatekeeper as a resource. And that got me access to the executive. She showed me how to get to him. She put me on his calendar to be able to have a discussion with him. And then he ultimately became my mentor within that organization. That didn't happen in the first meeting. It happened after a while. And now he's someone who sells in my absence within that organization. So it's really, really interesting that you can work with gatekeepers and they can help you develop that relationship and ultimately have you get access to the executive and then develop a long-term relationship with the executive. The key here is also, you want to remember this, each interaction with an executive either dilutes or enhances your credibility. Just remember that, each interaction. So you want to always be on your toes when you're operating at the executive level. Now, let's talk about the 3 levels of learning. We work on this in the workshop. We have salespeople make sure that they're prepared for that critical first meeting with a client executive. And we tell them, you have to know something about your client's industry, your client's company, and that includes your client's customers, that includes your client's competitors, and lastly, the client executive himself or herself. You have to know a little bit about that executive you're going to call on. What are their main business objectives? Where have they worked before? Who might you know in their network? Who can help you develop a relationship with that senior executive? And we tell them and hand to them you're going to see this in just a minute, what we call a guide to client discovery. But we talk about some of the websites they can use in terms of getting information about the client's industry, client's company, using a tool like Inside View, and the client executive, LinkedIn. Before I make any call on a client executive, I look them up on LinkedIn Do I know them? Do I know any executive who's connected to them? Do I know any people who are connected to them? Do I have some common connections? Okay? And as I said, we distribute this guide to client discovery to help salespeople pursue these 3 levels of learning. And then we talk about how are you going to make that initial face-to-face call on a client executive? What do you have to do? What do you have to do to prepare for that? And how would you conduct the actual meeting? We give them a template for an actual meeting, saying that you want to cover these types of areas, and the pie pieces that are going to come up in the upper left, the right here, are going to show you about how much time to spend in each of these areas. You've got to introduce yourself, citing your past experience. Where have you helped other clients solve similar problems? Then you need to talk about the issues and implications facing that executive, asking some questions that get you credit for your homework, confirming your level of preparation, discussing the issues and implications using the client's metrics, the client's terminology. And if there's a key initiative that they're focused on, you want to confirm the importance of that initiative. Then, and only then, might you explore some potential solutions, developing a vision of the optimal solution and confirming the value of that solution. And lastly, you want to have a moving forward strategy with that executive. You want to have a way to reconnect with that executive. You want to have an action plan that involves the executive. And if the executive sends you down to a lower level executive in the client organization, there are 2 things you should always do. Number 1, ask for an introduction to that lower level person. That shows the lower level person the importance of meeting with you. And secondly, you should ask the executive, can I come back and reconnect with you after I've had that meeting with that lower level person to review our findings and to share where we think we should go moving forward. So those are some of the things you can do even if you're sent down to a lower level person, lower level executive in the client organization. Now, any initial call on a client executive should have these major objectives with it. Obviously, you want to establish rapport very quickly. By the way, these come from a book called All for One, written by Andrew Sobel. Happens that I actually subscribe to this, and I'm hand in glove with him on these areas. Secondly, confirm your understanding of the executive's key business issues. Now, you go into the meeting with some level of knowledge about the business issues facing the executive. You want to get the executive's perspective on those top issues. Third, you want to demonstrate some level of capability. Where have you solved a similar problem? And lastly, you want to create some next steps that involve the executive. Pretty simple, straightforward. Keep this in the back of your mind as you're making that initial call. You want to come out of that meeting with these 4 objectives having been accomplished. Okay, we're selling to different level, C-level executives. You need to understand when you're dealing with, even with different C-level executives, they have different issues. CEO, CFO, Chief Financial Officer, CMO, in this case the Chief Medical Officer, they have different issues. You want to focus on their issues. The CFO, optimizing financial metrics, reducing costs, leveraging the perception of financial analysts in terms of what they think of his company, maximizing the return from the firm's assets. Those kinds of things are important to the CFO. So you want to know and understand that when you're meeting with them. Let's talk lastly about creating your value. Most important. And again, remember, executives want you to come back and tell them about the value you created and delivered to them. Don't assume they know. Make sure you communicate that value. Now let's talk about, when you're developing your customer-focused value proposition, what I call the 3 components of value. And most salespeople only focus on the last one of these, but there are 2 others that are so important. Number one, you. You have value. You have personal value. Your experience, your background, where you've helped other clients. Key component of value. Secondly, your company. The value of your company's resources beyond your solution. You have resources that you can apply to that company that you may forget about. Make sure you're able to communicate these to the executive. And lastly and finally, your solution, the value of your company's solutions. And most salespeople, as I said before, only focus on that. But when you take these three components of value together, they differentiate you from your competitors. There's no other competitor out there that can have these three components of value, the same components of value. They can compete with you perhaps on solution, but think about how you bring personal value and how you can bring additional resources to that client organization. Now, what happens here is when you're developing a customer-focused value proposition, again, start with the customer. Look at the key business initiative that your solution is focused on, and then take these three elements of value that we've just talked about and how they overlap defines your specific business value. And again, no competitor can come up with exactly those three components. So when you're developing this customer-focused value proposition, now this is a different level of value proposition. This is perhaps what I might call the granular level, where you've got to talk to the client about, first of all, what's important to them, how you can create value for them, and then where have you done this before? How can you demonstrate your capability? Okay. So what we do in the workshop, we have activities obviously around this, but we also give them a template, and I'm going to populate this template here and let it play out for just a second. And this is really 2 sentences, very powerful sentences, that if you deliver a completed template to the client executive, to that relevant executive in the client organization, it will have a powerful impact. Let me share some examples with you, okay? Now, typically, you're going to have to work with client people to get this information, to gather this information, to be able to complete this template, if you will. But here's an example of a value proposition. Again, this happens to be for the case study that we used in the workshop. And I'm just going to let you read it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You should be able to improve efficiencies, optimize outcomes with our new joint replacement techniques, and far exceed patient outcomes you're achieved with your existing protocols. Our solutions are designed to create a reduction in surgical episode time, which can lead to increased number of cases per day and an overall reduction in infection occurrence. Now, wow, if you presented this to the hospital executive, chief medical officer, that might really resonate with him or her. But what's missing from that value proposition? Well, very simply, what's missing is the quantification of value. And look how different and compelling that value proposition looks if I add the quantification of value right here. Okay? This could result in an annual savings to you of $2.5 million based on an improved infection rate of 0.35%. versus last year's rate of 1.8%, which was still below the national average. Okay, very powerful. Now, what do you think if I presented this provocative and compelling value proposition to the CFO, Benjamin Wu? What would he think? I think he'd be pretty impressed. I think it would motivate him to move forward with your solution. And that's where you want to get to. You want to get to your value proposition to the point where it forces that executive to move ahead. They can't leave this value proposition on the table. They can't decide to do nothing. Saving $2.5 million in a hospital organization, tremendous amount of profit to them goes straight to the bottom line. Okay, let's look at another example, a little more general. You should be capable of reducing annual travel expenses, resulting in an annual savings of $5.9 million by implementing our telepresence system. This will require an investment of $5.3 million, but that's going to be returned within 11 months. We implemented a similar solution at this company, who began achieving an annual savings of $7.5 million. Again, compelling, provocative, motivates them to take action. Okay, let me summarize what we've talked about today. First of all, executives get involved early in the decision process, but also late to monitor the implementation, measure the results. Ticket to a free meeting with the executive. They want to see you. Make sure you communicate your value and talk to them about the past value you've delivered to them and their organization. Identifying the relevant executive and aligning with that executive should be key elements of your sales process. Aligning with Benjamin Wu, the CFO, in the case study, critical for us to be able to win the deal. The best approach for that initial call is to work with a credible sponsor or treat the gatekeeper as a resource to help you gain access to the executive. Make certain you're prepared for that critical first call on an executive by doing your research at those 3 levels of learning: the client's industry, the client's company, the client executive himself or herself. Next, credibility is the intersection of capability and integrity. And remember, executives buy not when they understand, but when they feel they are understood. Let me say that one more time. Executives buy not when they understand, but when they feel they are understood. They want you to let them talk and tell you and give you information before you propose a solution back to them. You gain credibility by demonstrating capability and integrity. And last, consistently communicating your value to executives should be an integral part of your relationship strategy. Just remember that. Consistently communicating your value. You should find a way to do formal value reviews after your solution is installed, to go back to those executives and to tell them the value you're continuing to deliver to them. So I'm going to end with this chart. Most people look at this and they say, wow, yeah, you're right. So you have to, sometimes it takes a second for you to be able to look at that and get that message there. Don't let this happen to you. Okay. I hope you received value from the webinar today on the SellXL workshop. As you probably heard from me, I'm pretty excited about the value this workshop can deliver to you and to your organization. If you'd like additional information, please contact me. My contact information is on the screen. You can also see some more information about SellXL on my website, sellxl.com. Thank you so much for attending this session today, and make it a great day. Thank you.